I'm going to talk about Spin Dictators, which is our book with Daniel Treisman, who is a political scientist, professor of political science at the University of California in Los Angeles. This is a book which came out last year. I'm trying to book that came out last year. Now it's going to be a paperback edition with a new preface. It will be clear why we needed a new preface, because we finished this book before the war, and we actually finished this book pretty early on in May 2021. And we did see certain things going in the wrong direction. So it's not like we said things will be fine, but we did need to catch up in the new edition. The book has been translated into about 10 languages, and somebody told me that there is a publisher in Italy who's interested as well. But in English, it's available since last spring in audio and digital and paper. Now, let me say what this book is about. So this book is about the change in how dictators worked and even looked in 20th and 21st century. If you look at the images of 20th century tyrants, they are mostly projecting fear. They rule through repression, through open mass repression, through force. And that is not a coincidence that many of them would wear military or paramilitary uniform. Some of them were real generals like Pinochet or Videla in Argentina. Some of them were surgeons or soldiers or no military experience before political career, and yet they would wear military uniform. Why? Because they want to project force, brutality, and repression. Now, today's non-democratic leaders are different. They wear business suits. They go to Davos. They talk to investors. They talk to democratic leaders. And most importantly, while they are non-democratic leaders, they are still trying to pretend to be Democrats. And here I show you some of the people featured in our book or in a new preface. It's Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of modern Singapore, Fujimori, who was one of the pioneers of the new model, president of Peru, Chavez, Hugo Chavez, Viktor Orban, and Putin until today, until last year. So basically the idea is that these people pretend to be democratic leaders. They therefore don't use mass violence, don't use open violence, and they want to pretend to have no outlandish ideology, and most importantly, they pretend to be Democrats, as I said. And this is exactly the main idea of our book: how to understand how these regimes work, where they come from, how they manage to have popularity, or at least seeming popularity, imitate democracy, and stay in power. Our book also talks about issues why these regimes have emerged, and the last chapter is what we need to do about this. So it's not like we are saying that the old-style regimes completely disappeared. You still have Syria or North Korea. You still have Belarus and modern Putin, which has transformed itself. The regime of Putin has transformed itself in 2022. I'll talk about that as well. What our book is talking about, and we look at the data, and one of the things I would mention is we have a website here, spindictators.com, where we have all the data and code which reproduces tables and graphs and so on. The book itself is a general audience book, but it's backed by academic publications we had in academic journals and a lot of data analysis. And so these data are actually available at this website, spindictators.com. Now, our main idea is that if you look at the data, you see there is a structural change in how non-democratic world operates. Basically, majority of today's non-democratic leaders are spin dictators rather than fear dictators. 21st century dictatorships were based on repression and fear. 21st century majority of non-democratic leaders are working in a different way. They work through manipulation of information, through pretending that they're democratically elected leaders. And that's basically what we do in this book. If there are questions, I will talk more about the data, but this is one of the most important charts in our book. So what we do in this chart, we take all non-democratic regimes, we kick out short-lived regimes which would stay in power only for a few years. So we only take regimes which are in power for at least 5 years. And then we classify them by decades when they came to power. And basically, then we look at the share of dictators of fear and dictators of spin. And you see that majority of dictators were fear dictators until a couple of decades ago, 2-3 decades ago, the situation changed qualitatively. And now spin dictators are a majority. And so these numbers don't add up to 100%, and I won't bore you with our methodology. So our methodology for classifying those regimes is based on several characteristics such as political killings, political prisoners, existence of at least a few independent media, and non-one-party systems. So basically, when we look at this data, we collected a lot of data, and our data are on the website, as I mentioned. You can look at political killings, you can look at political prisoners. Whatever you do, you see that there is a great decline in share of non-democratic regimes that use open violence. And therefore, we shouldn't be surprised that now spin dictators are a majority. So whatever the data you look at, you see a great decline in violence in recent decades. Now, some regimes we cannot classify because we don't find data. It's actually not easy for some regimes to find data on torture, political prisoners, political killings, and so on. But the general trend is very clear. And whatever you do, whatever data series you look at, you see the decline in open repression and increase in manipulation of information. So basically, this is the main difference. Fear dictatorships rule through open fear. Spin dictatorships try to deceive the public. And that is a main change which has happened in recent decades. As I said, since the last 30-40 years, we see a massive decline in the share of regimes that use political killings, political prisoners, torture, and other tools. Now, what is important is that spin dictators also use violence, but they conceal use of violence. Why? Because they want to pretend to be Democrats. Democrats don't use repression. So you use repression in a targeted and deniable way. And of course, if you want to conceal repression, if you want to if you want to conceal repression, you cannot use mass repression. You almost automatically have to be targeted. You have to limit the scale. And this is what spin dictators do. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples. You know, Colonel Gaddafi started his tenure at the age of fear dictatorships. He ended his tenure in 2011 when spin dictators were already a rule rather than an exception. But in his head, he thought that fear dictatorship is actually a good model. And he said that leaders who deny their violence against political opponents are not right. The right thing to do is, if we execute somebody, we execute this person on television. So this is the model of open repression. Now, this is the model of spin repression. So, you know, Russian opposition leader Boris Nemtsov was killed in front of the Kremlin. And Putin said, we don't know who did it. Eventually, he investigated this and put some soldiers, actually serving soldiers of police units, actually Chechen police units killed Boris Nemtsov. But Vladimir Putin said, it's a provocation against me. I was not there. Boris Nemtsov didn't deserve to die. And I don't know, we don't practice political repression. And whatever you do in political repression in Russia, you see that Putin always says, we are a democracy, we don't have political prisoners. That has changed in last year, I'll talk about that. So how do they manage it? Our book is exactly about various tools in their toolkit. And basically in our book, which I highly recommend, it's a good book, you, in each chapter, have an instrument which spin dictators use, and then you have a story of an individual dictator. So our analysis is based on global data set, but we also profile certain people like Fujimori or Chavez or a former Kazakhstani president Nazarbayev or Putin in this book, because sometimes these people are very good in using this particular instrument. So this is a typical tool that they do. For example, Yashin in 2019 wanted to participate in an election, and he couldn't candidate because he was always in jail. And never he would be in jail for a long term. He would be in jail for a week, 2 weeks, a month, and each time when he re-emerged from the jail cell, he would be arrested again and sent to jail again. And also what is important, the prosecution is for non-political crimes. We give here an example of Kurdish politician Nureddin Demirtas, who is a brother of the current Kurdish political leader. So he was arrested in the end of 2000s for faking a medical certificate to avoid a military draft. So Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader, was arrested for defrauding a French cosmetics company, and so on. So this is typical there. Now, elections are an important tool. Since you pretend to be Democrat, you want to have elections. On the other hand, you want to run elections in the way that you don't lose them. And sometimes, of course, spin dictators make mistakes, but they have a lot of tools to make sure that they don't lose election. And normally, these tools are also hidden, concealed, deniable tools. So there are still regimes which ban opposition politicians from running, but more often there is harassment, and more often there is media bias, a lack of access of opposition politicians to media. And this is now a tool of choice of non-democratic regimes. Now, other differences. Not only these guys look different, they also talk different. So they also don't have ideology. So some people say that Putin and Orban have conservative ideology. Well, in many ways, it's not an ideology. At least it's not a global ideology such as Nazism or Bolshevism. So spin dictators pretend to be normal Democrats, and democracies don't have ideologies. And what is more important is these guys talk like democratic leaders. What we've done with them, we collected data on speeches of spin dictators, speeches of democratic leaders, and speeches of fear dictators. And we compare the number of words associated with violence and associated with economic performance. And we find that spin dictators, in terms of share of words associated with economy or public goods provisions, they're indistinguishable statistically from democratic leaders. While both democratic leaders and spin dictators are statistically different from fear dictators who talk much more about violence. And so in this sense, it's actually an empirical result. The text analysis shows that spin dictators pretend to be Democrats, not only in their looks, but also in their speeches. Now, just to give you a summary of the comparison, once again, spin dictators rule through deception, little open repression, very few political killings or political prisoners. Whenever they do it, they conceal it and deny their use of repression. They also allow some opposition media, usually with small audience, and then they say, well, we don't have censorship, So small audience means that nobody's interested in those opposition media, but they exist. Theoretically, they could have gotten a big audience. Sometimes they do. They co-opt the owners of media. Sometimes they do censorship through other tools. Sometimes through technical tools. Sometimes they use censorship to protect children from pedophilia, so something like this. But they do it in a covered way. In Russian the constitution still today, censorship is prohibited. And we show that people living in those countries, in spin dictatorships, don't really know that censorship is so strong. So this is actually the great advantage of censorship. You can censor information on censorship. So people don't know that censorship exists and is in fact very strong. While in fear dictatorships, it was completely open. Soviet Union had a special department of censorship, and it was very clear that many things you just can't publish. So it was completely unashamed. On ideology, as I said, ideology is not there. Propaganda works, but it works in a different way. Propaganda in fear dictatorships was about ideology. Propaganda in spin dictatorships is about competence of the regime, competence of the leader. And also it's much more subtle and sophisticated. It's much more similar to Western style of presenting information and news. Interestingly, as I said, they pretend to be Democrats. And most importantly, they are open to trade and investment, cross-border. They don't impose bans to exit. From Soviet Union, it was very hard to leave. Putin's always happy to let people leave. And also, as I mentioned, these people go to Davos. Why? Because they want to benefit from better technology available in the West, from economic prosperity that you can achieve through trade and cooperation with more advanced countries. And so this is what they do. Now, as I mentioned, we also talk in the book about why they change and what to do about it. So what I've been talking until now is based on data. So we look at various characteristics of the regimes, how they work, what they do, how they do it. Now, when I talk about why they change, it's much more speculative, because essentially we don't have a convincing way to identify the causal chain here. But still, we speculate, and I believe in what we are saying. I think what we are saying is actually correct. And basically, we believe that the change in the nature of dictatorships has happened because of the march of modernization and globalization. In today's world, you no longer need people who can only read and write, like in the 1930s. For industrialized economy, you need people who can read and write. For post-industrial economy, you need people with tertiary education. And these people have critical thinking. You also need to provide room for innovation, decentralized economic models. All of that is very, very hard to do. On top of that, since globalization is really the source of economic prosperity, you need to engage with the global economy. You cannot just do North Korean solution, because then you cannot prosper. And so basically, this is the story we are telling. We are telling the story of the rise of globalized economy and technological progress, and the importance of higher education. There is also something which happened in the end of 1980s, which was the fall of Berlin Wall. That may have also contributed. As a one-off event, the end of Cold War stopped the model of fear dictators backed by the West. Before the end of the Cold War, we would have lots of dictators who would use repression, but since they were anti-communist, the West would close its eyes on all the torture and repression. After the disappearance of the existential threat of Soviet Union, this concept disappeared as well. No longer you need to support brutal regimes. Now you can actually support NGOs like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. And so this is also something which has changed. You can still think about war on terror, for example, where US has an ally like Saudi Arabia, which is not a democratic country and a very repressive dictatorship. However, these are very small scale cases relative to Cold War, when the threat was really existential. So interestingly, this is of course not a new idea. And if you look at the work by Seymour Martin Lipset, an American sociologist who wrote about this 60 years ago, he wrote a paper and a book, and a lot of people said he's right, some people said he's wrong. But his idea was that modernization is a prerequisite for consolidated democracy. If you have more people who are educated and have property, democracy is more likely to succeed. And there have been a number of regressions that show that it's not necessarily true. Actually, my co-author Dan Trisman wrote a paper showing that if you allow for lags and nonlinear relationships, there is a relationship between modernization and democratization. But our argument is actually different. Our argument is not about the link between modernization and democracy. What we are saying is, first, we are not talking about the impact of modernization on a regime within a country. We are talking about global modernization with the impact on a non-democratic country. So if you have more globalized economy, if you have Amnesty International, if you have CNN, if you have Facebook, then any given non-democracy start thinking that probably we need to change from fear to spin. Second, we don't say that modernization leads to democracy. What we are saying is we have discovered this new breed of dictatorships, which is more suited for the modern world of globalized economy and knowledge economy. So in a sense, previously the modernization school would say modernization leads from fear dictatorship to democracy. What we are saying is there is a new breed of dictatorships which is better fitted for this world, and almost in a Darwinian way, this evolution created another opportunity. Under the pressure of modernization, dictatorships move from fear dictatorship to spin dictatorship. Eventually, as we speculate, spin dictatorships will probably be non-sustainable. And I'll say in a second why. But initially, our argument is spin dictatorships emerge as a response to the challenges of modernization, globalization. And so our argument is not that you move from a dictatorship to democracy, but you move from fear to spin. Now, we can speculate again on what happens in the future. If modernization and globalization continues, then you have this pressure on fear to become spin and on spin to democratize. Why? Because spin dictators need, they face a very important trade-off. They need people with higher education, the knowledge workers, the creative class, because this is the class that produces economic growth, which helps to project an image of competence. On the other hand, these people understand what's going on. They have critical thinking. They challenge the dictator. And so his job is to silence the creative class in a way that the creative class doesn't explain to the rest of the society that this dictator should be gone. And basically, if the creative class is sufficiently small, that's doable. If it's very large, you need to censor it, or you need to co-opt it, bribe it, you need to use targeted repression. All of that may be difficult. And so the bigger the creative class, the more difficult it is to sustain the spin dictatorship system. So then some spin dictators divest the constraints and become more democratic. Some spin dictators actually revert to fear. And when you see that your spin model is falling apart, and we believe that this is what happened to Putin in the end of the second decade of the 21st century, when modern technology, namely social media, the rise of educated Russian class, and Russia is a very educated country, resulted in a young generation listening to YouTube videos, watching YouTube videos of Alexei Navalny, and rising against Putin. And so he initially poisoned Navalny, then put him in jail. Then finally he understood that he needs mass repression. He needs open repression. And that's exactly what happened recently. He's not alone. And when we were writing this book, we said this may happen to Putin, but we also talked about the change between Chavez and Maduro. Chavez is a typical spin dictator. Maduro is a typical fear dictator. And what is striking, and we show here this picture where Chavez, who was a real officer, a colonel, is wearing a suit. And Maduro, who was a bus driver, is wearing a paramilitary uniform, because Maduro's regime is based on fear. Same happened to Erdogan, and you may say the same happened to Putin. Here I show this picture of Putin with a gun, but most importantly, what has happened this year, if you watch Putin's New Year address, Putin is given a New Year speech surrounded by soldiers in military uniform. This has never happened. Previously, Putin would give a speech in a suit in front of the Kremlin and not in front of military men. So this is very, very important. On the other hand, we believe that like North Korea demonstrates, it's very hard to remain a fear dictatorship in today's world because you cannot deliver prosperity. So your citizens, through whatever means, using VPN and social media, learn that your economy is falling back, and eventually fear dictatorships will not be sustainable as well. Now, what the West can do? Now, this is again highly speculative chapter. This is the last chapter. What we are saying is you need to first and foremost wake up to the simple reality that spin dictators are still dictators. These are regimes which are not interested in democratization. They are not interested in fair competition in elections. These are regimes which want to concentrate power and keep power. And then also means that they sometimes interfere in other countries. I would give an example of using dirty money to bribe Western politicians. Basically, corruption is not a bug, but a feature of these regimes. They pretend to be Democrats, so they cannot steal openly. They pretend that they have normal salaries, but they need to also bribe the elites. They need to bribe ministers. They need to bribe policemen to be loyal to them. A minister of finance in Russia should be paid several times as much as minister of finance in France, because if this is not the case, minister of finance in Russia will not be loyal and will think maybe if we democratize, I'll be doing well. So there is a lot of lots of great payments in countries like Russia. And then this gray money is exported to bribe Western politicians. Why? Because you ask them to facilitate your cooperation with tech companies, with investors, get you a seat in Davos, and so on and so forth. Now, sometimes this corruption is discovered. And then you also say, not bad, because you can go back to your voters and say, look, do you see that Western politicians are corrupt? So the West is not great as well. And so maybe I'm not doing well and our country is corrupt as well, but everybody's corrupt. And this is an important part of the narrative, that it's not that spin dictator says, I'm a great leader. Usually they say, I'm an okay leader, but leaders in the West are even worse. And for that, they want to undermine Western democratic institutions. And whatever the West, wherever the West fails, that reinforces the power of spin dictators at home. And that's why we say that the West should always think about putting its own house in order. This is not just good for Western voters, it's also good for destroying the narrative of spin dictators. Now, one other thing is international institutions. These guys pretend to be Democrats to enter and abuse international institutions. In the EU, we have Hungary, which undermines EU unity on sanctions. In NATO, we have Turkey, which slows down accession of Sweden and Finland. We also give an example. Until recently, Russia was a member of UN Human Rights Commission. We also give an example of Interpol, which is led by a general from Emirates. In France, this general is being accused of torture. So all of that is suggesting that we need to think how democracies can bring back control over institutions that maintain liberal international order. And finally, one thing which we talk about is how badly a war like Iraq war undermined credibility of the West. And we argue that if you want to support democracy around the world, do it in a democratic, ethical way. Sometimes that means that you have to accept defeats. Sometimes you have to be patient. But this is remember that spin dictators thrive on spin, on public opinion, and it's important to win global public opinion. Like today, we see that global South is actually not clearly in favor of Ukraine. Why? Because they say that Putin is a victim of American imperialism. While in reality, of course, Putin is an imperialist who destroys the former colony Ukraine. So this is fascinating to what extent the West has failed to win back global public opinion. And we call it adversarial engagement because we think that it is in our interest to promote the growth of creative class within those countries. And so while the engagement should be adversarial, it still should be engagement, because these regimes will suffer from the rise of educated class inside them. So let me stop here and say once again that the argument is that spin dictators are regimes based on manipulation of information rather than on repression. And spin dictators are now majority of non-democratic regimes. They pretend to be Democrats. They speak like Democrats. And the reason they emerged is because if you pretend to be Democrat, Western investors can talk to you. They can go back to their boardrooms and say, look, this guy is not Kim. This guy is not Assad. He wears a business suit and he doesn't use open repression and censorship. So let's do business with him. And so in that sense, it's not surprising that these regimes emerged. And in that sense, we should promote adversarial engagement and increase number of educated people in those countries, because that eventually will make those regimes unsustainable. The risk is, of course, that you may end up with a situation like Putin's or Chavez, where the regime goes back to 20th century model based on fear. And that is a tragedy. But overall, I would rather end on an optimistic note for two reasons. Spin dictators are less violent. And second, the very fact that spin dictators pretend to be Democrats shows that they don't have any other idea. And they know that idea of democracy is actually popular. And in that sense, the very existence of spin dictators is probably a good sign, a sign that we don't have an existential ideological challenge. So let me stop here.